wonderfully terrible. Wonderful. Hello, my name's Gavin, this is Genre Books, and today I am continuing a little sub-series of pulp explorations with a look at another spicy pulp. This is the third of what's going to be 4 videos. In March I did Spicy Detective. Last month in April it was Spicy Adventure. Next month I'll be finishing with Spicy Western, but this month, in honour of Horror Mayhem, I'm looking at Spicy Mystery. All of these pulps produced by the same publishing company. And in a way that gives me a little bit of trepidation when talking about them, because a lot of the faults of these pulp magazines are evident throughout all of the titles, and finding stuff to say about some of the authors can be a little bit difficult because the same writers are employed again and again, no matter what the genre. Many of the authors also have very little biographical information that I can find, and quite a few of them are writing under pseudonym, making it even more difficult. However, there always seems to be something I can pick up on in these, something which leads me in an odd direction, quite often in the realm of comic books, which is not natural ground for me, and this week's is no exception. Let's start with the magazine itself. Volume 5, issue number 3, June 1937. And on the cover we can see a mistake straight off the bat. The cover story, the coffinless corpse, is misattributed. I will give the correct attribution as we now go through the stories. And we start with 30 Seconds by Robert Leslie Bellum. I've spoken about Bellum because he has written for both the issues of Spicy Detective and Spicy Adventure that I've spoken about. He is most famous for Dan Turner, Hollywood Detective, but he seems to be able to turn his pen to all manner of genres, as this shows. This is a contemporary tale, or contemporary to 1937, and it has the feeling akin to a Twilight Zone episode. The lust is certainly evident. It has to be with these spicy pulp tales, but there's nothing here that you would look at today and think too spicy. This is followed by Rain in Dahomey by Carl Moore. This is one of the more problematic stories in the magazine, and it is the depiction of Africans in the story which is particularly problematic, but it is very oddly problematic. I'll try to explain myself. We have a white English couple in Africa on some kind of diplomatic mission, never adequately explained. Their marriage seems to be on the rocks. The wife is being wooed successfully by the military commander of a passing French, I don't know if it's a Foreign Legion garrison or something of the type. But the husband seems to be beyond caring. He definitely appears to have fallen out of love with his wife. Instead, he transfers his attractions to one of the black serving staff at the mission. Does he wrestle here with the morality of infidelity and with his own failings? No, he wrestles with the morality of falling for a woman of another race. He doesn't wrestle too hard though. He acts upon his impulses. And in this story there is a cult. There is sacrifice, animal and human. There is mayhem and military intervention. But it's a cop-out of the story when it transpires that he only fell for the black woman because he has been drugged. I should, of course, have issues with the objectification of women in the story, and I do, but I also knew what I was getting into by reading a 1930s spicy pulp. What I think I have more objections to is that there is not an equality of objectification. The writer is at pains to tell us that this isn't a rational decision. He has been coerced into falling for a woman of another race. There is, I suppose, just an embarrassment of riches in the things that you can be outraged about in a story like this, and you have to put some kind of hierarchy in place. I think it's much easier to laugh off the objectification angle purely because this now seems so tame by modern standards. The race issue, which would have seemed to perhaps have been more normalised in the 1930s, is much more front and centre an issue here. It's also not a great story. That helps in deciding to maybe skip this author if I see him again. The next story I also found it more difficult to get into. This is Prophecy to Kill by Colby Quinn. Now the problem I have here isn't just with the writer. It's a problem that I found definitely reading these magazines in PDF format. I don't know why, but the magazines specifically, I'm finding these Spicy Pulps begin a story, will have 10 pages of the story, and then at the end it will say this story continues on page 112. I then go to 112. In a magazine this would have been very easy, flicking the page. In a PDF it's a little bit more laborious. It brings you out of the flow of the story, and in this particular case is even worse because it has 2 breaks in the story. You are sent to later in the magazine, and then the third and final section concludes right near the end of the magazine. But at the end of the second section, it didn't tell me that it continued elsewhere. The story I thought was very confusing, but that's because it ended without the final act. I then had to go back and reread it once I had seen by chance that the story was continued later on. And I'm not entirely sure that this story was worth all that extra effort. It's a story showing the inner torment of a mentally unstable man, but confuses mental instability and delirium tremens and worries about psychoanalysis. I think even had the story been one continuous block of text, there would still be enough incoherence here to not allow me to rate this one very highly. However, the next story is The Black Thing Walks by Stuart Gates, a proper sort of monster feature. in this magazine. This story really gives some of the hallmarks of these spicy pulps and adds a bit more of a problem on top of things as well. But if you are playing spicy pulp bingo, the first mention of breasts is only on the third line. The monster turns up on page 2. There is a fairly racist accent portrayed later on the same page. It did strike me at this point, especially the point I was reading the accent, that this pulp magazine was printed at a time closer to the American Civil War than it is to modern day. And I really think it shows. What this story shows is the introduction of another element to the spicy pulps, which Spicy Detective and Spicy Adventure did not. And this is something which you also see in a number of other horror pulps and even magazines like Weird Tales, and that is the allusions to the bondage and sadism part of the horror stories. These are presented just in terms of pure sadism in many of the horror magazines. A spicy horror magazine accentuates the sexual aspect of this, and I think it makes spicy mystery more risque than the previous spicy pulps that I've read, and perhaps it is the reason it's a bigger seller, or was a bigger seller than the other spicy pulps back in the 1930s. Granted, characters in Spicy Detective and Spicy Adventure do find themselves tied up, but this is usually because of the expediences of the plot. It isn't the actual plot itself, which it is here. It's initially unsettling when presented against the other spicy pulp stories and even the other stories in this particular magazine. Thankfully, it's still tame compared to what you can pick up in contemporary literature. But I'd say this one's a bit of a jolt. It's, for the most part, pedestrian in its writing style, lazy with its choice of villains, and not particularly revelatory in its conclusion. It's more a sort of Scooby-Doo ending, but with some nasty stuff that happens beforehand. But we follow that up with one of the better stories of the magazine, and the cover story as well, Corpseless Coffin by Clint Morgan. So it's Clint Morgan and not the writer shown on the cover. But Clint Morgan is, as I said in a previous video, the pseudonym for Edwin Truett Long. This is a decent enough story. It's an interesting premise, and there's a gypsy's curse, which, is something that crops up from time to time in horror literature. And for once, it looks like a woman scorned is finally getting the chance to exact revenge, which is unusual to have a proper female antagonist in these stories. It's almost an emancipation of sorts, but don't worry, it's a fleeting feeling and it doesn't last long. But it still makes this story better than most that are in this magazine. And that is followed up by Mojave Madness by E Hoffman Price. And this also has, it transpires, a female antagonist. I want to look at E Hoffman Price because here is a writer not writing under pseudonym, and one who has a much wider history in horror and mystery pulps. E Hoffman Price was born in 1898, died in 1988. He joined the military early on, and he served in Mexico and the Philippines before joining the expeditionary force to France and fighting in World War I. He begins to go career as a soldier. After the First World War, he returns to America and graduates in 1923 from West Point Academy. After this point, he leaves the military, begins working for a firm, Union Carbide, and starts writing in his spare time. And it doesn't take him long after starting to write his stories to actually get them published. He sold his first story in 1924 to Droll Stories and followed that up with his first sale to Weird Tales in 1925. He writes solidly but still part-time until 1932. The Great Depression is now with us. He loses his job and turns to writing full-time. Moves from New Orleans, I think he was living, to go to Manhattan to make it easier to sell to the pulp magazines. As well as Weird Tales, he also wrote for Weird Tales' short-lived sister magazine, Magic Carpet, which is a magazine I covered last year in Spring into Adventure. He also writes for Terror Tales, Speed Detective, which is the magazine that Spicy Detective became when it was forced to change its name to satisfy the Vice Police. Also Spicy Western Stories, and of course Spicy Mystery, where we find him here. Under his sole name, he had about 25 stories published in Weird Tales over the years. He also co-wrote stories with Otis Adelbert Kline and memorably with H.P. Lovecraft. That story is Through the Gates of the Silver Key. I think you could make an argument for E. Hoffman Price being the fourth member of the Weird Tales trio, which comprises H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith. Incidentally, E. Hoffman Price seems to be the only person in the world who ever met all three of those writers face to face. His light dimmed with the passing of the pulps, but in the late 60s and 70s he was rediscovered by a new generation of readers. His stories were published as anthologies and he began writing horror novels. He was also the recipient of the World Fantasy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1984, 4 years before his death. He also had a memoir published posthumously in 2001. It has the apposite title, The Book of the Dead. He talks about not only his own works, but the writers that he knew. So, Kline, Lovecraft, Howard, Clark Ashton Smith. I think he was big friends with Edmund Hamilton as well. Everyone seems to have been big friends with Edmund Hamilton. I need to look more at Edmund Hamilton. Back to Spicy Mystery, however. Mojave Madness is certainly better than the majority of the stories in this magazine. It probably is the best written. I think it also takes the trophy for the best mammary illusion as well. Ivory fascinators that blossomed into view. That's almost poetry. This is a ghost story, but there is a scientific, well, there's a real world reason behind it, and also a real world motivator. As usual, money. In this case, a $1 million inheritance at stake. What it does have is a very 1930s feel. There is a bit of reefer madness propaganda thrown into here as well. The next story is The Brazen Bull by Clive Trent. Myths updated as a man finds himself in the Mediterranean, prisoner in I think it's Sicily. The writer gets Sicily and Crete a little bit confused, I feel. This is a nicely done story. It builds up the tension. I think possibly let down by the fact that the final payoff is a very rushed affair in comparison to how much lead up to the finale that you do get. What this story absolutely exemplifies, and this is something that happens in a lot of the spicy pulps, especially in spicy mystery, how dumb these heroes are. Spicy mystery does seem to have the dumbest crop. The ignorance is astounding. Maybe he thinks this is just because European women can be hot-blooded and crazy, but a woman turns up at the main character's window, literally knocking on the window to be let in to have their spicy time, and he just assumes that this is all normal.
Tap, tap, tap at the bloody window pane. I looked out. You know it was bloody Greta Garbo. Bloody Greta Garbo. Stark naked. Save for a shorty nighty.
When I think about how smart and competent and savvy the heroes are in almost any other line of pulps, it just shows you that in these spicy pulps they really are not thinking with their brains. This story is followed up by Blood of Youth by Arthur Wallace. This fits a lot into its 10 pages. A haunted house vibe, dastardly doctors, a Miss Havisham character-ish, morphine addicts, killer dogs and creepy servants, and also young thrusting heroes and heroines. This is largely run-of-the-mill. It's also a little bit of a tick box exercise for both horror and spicy stories. Nothing particularly wrong with it, but not really a standout story either. But we end with another one of the superior tales in this magazine, Head of Ahmed by C.A.M. Don. Now, C.A.M. Don is the pseudonym of Donald Clough Cameron. Born in Detroit in 1905 and died quite early in New York in 1954. He started as a crime reporter, first in Detroit and then in Ontario. I love it when I can find out some biographical details of some of the writers here. In the 1930s, he moved to New York and began writing for not only the pulps, but the comics, and following that, a series of detective novels. He is better known for his contributions to the world of comics than he is the world of pulps, or in fact detective novels, to be fair. His additions are mostly to the DC universe and quite a lot of it to the Batman story. He comes up with the character of Alfred the Butler. He also comes up with the Bat-Boat and Batman's Hall of Trophies, which is a precursor to the Bat Cave. He also creates the lesser known villains, the Cavalier and Tweedledum and Tweedledee. In terms of minor villains, for Superman he also creates the villain, the Toyman. And whilst he wasn't the inventor of the character of Superboy, he was the writer of the first Superboy stories. He also created characters such as Liberty Bell, Pow Wow Smith, and worked on established characters like Aquaman, Congo Bill, and Nighthawk. There was also a comic series of Clarence E. Mulford's character, Hopalong Cassidy, where he was one of the writers. As for the story here, there does seem to be some genuinely supernatural occurrences in the head of Ahmed. However, there does turn out to be a real life reason for the goings on, however implausible that reasoning is. This story is quite nicely done and again shows with spicy mystery that for all its failings, what it does bring to the spicy pulp party are female characters with a bit more agency. There are certainly more to these female characters in the role of antagonist or femme fatale than you ever find in their roles as heroines of these stories. Whenever you see a heroine in a spicy pulp, it's much more of the damsel in distress type of character. So to see them with a little bit more power, agency and input, even if it's not entirely wholesome, is certainly a bit more welcome. This issue of spicy mystery shows me the good and the bad about this spicy pulp line of magazines. The adverts, which I've interspersed here, remain remarkably terrible. I love them. The slapdash, hurried approach to the creation of these magazines, with stories appearing throughout the magazine, breaking up the narrative, is a detractor. Here, getting the author of the cover story wrong, minus marks for that. And the house style of descriptions, shall we say, euphemistically, does begin to grate after a while. But do not worry, normal pulp service will be resumed after next month or during next month. There is only one more spicy title that I have to read to have this little subset playlist of spicy pulps. And we're going from Spicy Mystery, which is the biggest seller in the spicy line, to the worst seller, Spicy Western. Something for everybody to look forward to there. I'm looking forward to the culmination of this, not entirely for the right reasons, I have to admit. And I can see why some of these writers, at least, are now forgotten. And some of them we never really knew at all. I can't find out the real names of some of these people. But there is always something to find in these magazines, should you dive deep enough. It may be finding out that they had other works under different names elsewhere which lead in very different directions. This publisher's links to the nascent detective comics really do give a lot of connections to the comic book industry as well. And the success of the comics leads into success in radio programs and television programs. So there is the kernel here of some interesting pop culture, but not always intrinsically of high quality itself. Essentially, in these spicy pulp magazines, there is more than their fair share of dross. But it is still worth reading to find those little nuggets of things that are not. But until next time, bye.
She just had a nightie on, is that all? That's all she had on, Dad, just a... See-through? A see-through, shorty nightie. Yeah, nothing else, except for her dark glasses, of course.